There's a specific kind of late-night feeling that comes with rewatching something you've already seen a dozen times. You know where everything is going, you know the lines before they land, you've seen it enough that you're not really watching in the active sense anymore, you're just being with it the way you might sit in a familiar room without doing anything in particular, just existing somewhere that feels like yours, and then something catches. A detail that doesn't quite fit, a line from one episode that sits a little awkwardly against something from 3 seasons later, a character whose age, when you actually do the arithmetic, doesn't resolve into anything coherent. And suddenly you're an hour deep into a fan wiki at midnight, which honestly is where a lot of the best evenings end up. That's what tonight is. A long, easy sit with Adventure Time, and more specifically with the places where the show's enormous, beautifully strange mythology doesn't quite add up to itself. Adventure Time ran for 10 seasons between 2010 and 2018, and it's one of those shows that was visibly building its world in real time. The early episodes are gentle and odd and quite funny, mostly standalone adventures where a boy called Finn and his shape-shifting dog Jake go off to fight something and come back home for tea. The later episodes are dense with a 1,000-year backstory, with characters who've been carrying grief for longer than most civilizations have existed, with cosmic mythology that the writers were clearly inventing and refining and occasionally forgetting as they went. The show changed enormously from start to finish, and mostly for the better, and in doing so, it accumulated inconsistencies the way any ambitious thing does. Loose threads, quiet contradictions, numbers that refuse to behave. That's what I want to sit with tonight. Not critically. I love this show, I've rewatched it an embarrassing number of times, and I'm still genuinely fond of it. Fond of Ooo and all the strange creatures living in it. The inconsistencies I want to talk about are, more than anything else, evidence of how much Adventure Time grew. A show that starts as a cartoon about a boy and his dog and ends as a meditation on identity, grief, and the nature of consciousness is going to have a few seams showing. That's expected, it's just interesting to look at. If you're new to this channel, I do these long lore essays regularly. Consider subscribing if that sounds like your sort of thing. Right? Let's start, more or less, at the beginning. Simon Petrikov is, depending on which episode you're watching and which piece of background material you've found, somewhere between 47 and a bit over 1,000 years old. Those two numbers aren't actually contradictory, to be fair. The crown that transformed him into the Ice King also preserved him, froze his biological aging somewhere around middle age, and left him stuck in the body of a man in his late 40s for roughly a millennium. So, 47 is his physical age, and somewhere north of 1,000 is how long he's actually been alive. The show confirms this explicitly in the season 6 episode, Betty, when Simon briefly regains his sanity and the crown is temporarily removed. He's 47 in the biological sense, that's the official answer, and it's quite a tidy one when you first hear it. Except it doesn't resolve everything, because the show has been somewhat vague across its run about exactly how old the Ice King is supposed to be in total, and the specific numbers that turn up in different episodes don't quite harmonize. Let me take this from the beginning. What we know about Simon Petrikov before the crown comes mostly from the video diaries Finn and Jake discover in Holly Jolly Secrets, the Christmas special from season 3 that first reveals the Ice King's real identity. In those recordings, Simon is a warm, slightly nervous man who describes himself as an antiquarian, a specialist in ancient artifacts, who bought what appeared to be a magical crown from a dockworker in Scandinavia. He put it on, he had a vision of a strange woman with instructions. He blacked out. He started doing things he couldn't explain and couldn't stop. His fiancée Betty, who he called his princess, left him because of what the crown was doing to him. He kept losing himself every time he wore it, and eventually he stopped getting himself back. There's nothing in those diaries that tells us exactly how old Simon was when this started, but the way he presents in the recordings suggests a man in his late 30s or early 40s, established academic, clearly thoughtful, clearly someone who has been at this for a while. The biographical age of 47, confirmed later, fits the impression he gives. Now, the original series pitch documents, which Cartoon Network would have reviewed before the show was commissioned, described the Ice King as approximately 1,000 years old, and the show's main timeline, as it develops across the later seasons, places the Mushroom War, the nuclear apocalypse that ended human civilization, at roughly 1,000 years before the show's present day. Simon was there. He survived because the crown kept him alive through the fallout and the centuries that followed. So, born sometime before the Mushroom War, preserved by the crown for the following 1,000 years, currently in the present day of Adventure Time, and ruling an ice kingdom while kidnapping princesses and feeling deeply sorry for himself. The 1,000-year figure makes sense in that context, and it's what most of the fandom uses as the baseline. But there's a detail from early in the show's run that doesn't quite fit. A couple of early episodes describe the Ice King as approximately 600 years old. Not 1,000, 600. This doesn't appear to ever be explicitly corrected on screen. It just quietly fades as the show's mythology expands and commits to a longer timeline. My best guess is that when those early episodes were written, the Mushroom War was still being conceptualized as having happened 6 centuries ago rather than a full millennium, and the writers were working out the chronology as they went. By the time I Remember You in Season 4 and Simon and Marcy in Season 5 properly established Simon and Marceline's shared history in the post-war world, the timeline had expanded, and that 600-year figure had simply been left behind. It's still there in those early episodes, a bit stranded, waiting to be noticed. There's also the matter of what the crown actually does to different people, which the show handles inconsistently in a way that matters for working out Simon's nature. In early episodes, the crown is presented as straightforwardly dangerous for anyone who wears it. If you put it on, it transforms you, it warps your mind, it does something permanent and terrible to whoever is inside. When Jake tries it on briefly in one episode, when Gunter wears it in another, when various other characters end up with it on their heads at different points, the show's framing initially suggests that anyone who puts it on is at risk. Which creates an obvious question. Why aren't they all gradually turning blue and developing opinions about princesses? The show eventually offers a more nuanced answer for this, though it does so several seasons after the confusion was first created. In Broke His Crown, a Season 7 episode where Finn and Princess Bubblegum essentially enter Simon's mind through the crown's internal systems, they encounter a sort of archive of every significant wearer. Simon is in there, partially himself, trapped beneath the Ice King's dominant personality. But the others who've worn the crown are not present in this internal archive. The implication that emerges is that the crown has a primary user, someone it has properly claimed and begun to fundamentally remake, and that everyone else who tries it on can borrow the powers temporarily without being taken over. Simon was the crown's choice. Something about him and the crown created a bond that no one else has quite managed to replicate, and everything the crown does to him is a consequence of that particular relationship. This is actually a reasonable and internally coherent explanation. The problem is that it was worked out retrospectively, fitted into the story a few years after the inconsistency it addresses was already on screen. Adventure Time does this quite a lot, as we'll see, and it usually works well enough. But it does mean that if you watch Seasons 1 and 2, and then immediately watch Season 7, the crown's rules have quietly changed without announcement. What I find genuinely interesting, though, rather than just technically inconsistent, is the question of what Simon Petrikov actually is now, after everything. In the Fionna and Cake spin-off, released in 2023 and set sometime after the main series finale, Simon appears as a man who looks like he's in his late 50s or early 60s. He's clearly aged since regaining his humanity at the end of Come Along With Me. He's dealing with depression, with the loss of Betty, with the strangeness of being a small, ordinary human in a magical world after centuries of being something vast and frightening and not entirely himself. He looks tired, he looks human, in a way that the Ice King never quite managed to. The exact amount of time that's passed between the main series and the spin-off is deliberately left ambiguous, which is the show's prerogative. But it does mean that Simon's biological age, which was definitively stated as 47 in Betty, is now somewhat higher, and exactly how much higher depends on a timeline the show has chosen not to specify. Which is a gentle kind of inconsistency, the kind that comes from a show being more interested in emotional truth than precise accounting. There's something quite moving about it, actually, if you sit with it for a moment. A man who spent roughly 1,000 years frozen in someone else's madness, preserved while everything around him died and was reborn and changed beyond recognition, getting out the other side and having to discover that normal aging, normal entropy, normal human decline is now happening to him again. He had been 47 for 1,000 years. Now he is not. Every grey hair is a small triumph and a small loss at the same time. The age inconsistencies in the Ice King storyline are real and they matter if you're trying to construct a precise chronology. The 600-year figure versus the 1,000-year figure is a meaningful discrepancy, and the retroactive crown rules are a genuine retcon rather than a planned reveal. The show's arithmetic simply doesn't resolve cleanly on Simon, and it never quite will. Still, 600 versus 1,000 is quite a significant difference if you're doing the arithmetic on your fingers. I just thought it was worth noting. One thing I find interesting is the way the show handles the question of whether Simon and Ice King are the same person. The show wants the answer to be yes, and also no, and also both, which is philosophically rich, but also narratively inconvenient. In Holly Jolly Secrets, the reveal is framed as tragic because Simon was a good man and Ice King is not. Therefore, the Ice King represents the loss of Simon, but later seasons push back on this framing somewhat. Ice King is lonely and strange and occasionally cruel, but also capable of real tenderness, real loyalty, moments of genuine kindness toward Finn and Jake and Marceline that feel like they belong to Simon even when the Ice King has no idea why he's doing them. The episode Broke His Crown gets at this most directly. When Finn and Bubblegum enter the crown's internal systems, they find Simon still in there, a kind of ghost preserved inside the mental architecture of the Ice King's madness. Simon is articulate and sad and precisely aware of what happened to him. He asks Finn to give him a message, a few words to say to Ice King, and those words are meant to help Ice King understand something about himself. The scene is beautiful. It is also technically strange because it implies that Simon and Ice King are two distinct consciousnesses sharing one body, which is a very specific and unusual setup that the show doesn't fully anatomize. If Simon is in there, awake and coherent, then the 1,000-odd years of Ice King's life were happening to Simon in some sense. He was present for all of it, just suppressed. The grief of that is immense, and the show acknowledges it. But it also means that Simon was never truly gone, just locked behind someone else's face. Which makes the Betty storyline even heavier. Betty spent years trying to free Simon from the crown, and Simon was there the whole time, watching through the Ice King's eyes, unable to reach her. The Fionna and Cake spin-off, to its credit, spends considerable time on what it means to be Simon post-crown, free but not repaired. He describes himself in the spin-off as someone who has been returned but not restored, which is a precise and rather painful distinction. The Simon who gets out of the Ice King is not the Simon who went in. He has the memories, the personality, the love for Betty, but he is also someone who spent 1,000 years as something he would not have chosen to be. That leaves marks that don't just dissolve when the crown comes off. Since we're on the subject of Simon's history, though, it's essentially impossible to talk about it without talking about Marceline, because the two of them are so deeply intertwined in Adventure Time's mythology that unpicking one always pulls on the other. And Marceline's timeline has its own set of complications that I've been meaning to get into for a while now. The relationship between Simon Petrikov and young Marceline is, I think, the emotional centerpiece of Adventure Time's lore. Everything that happens between them in the post-war rubble of the world, Simon slowly losing himself while trying to protect a child who was already ancient and strange in her own way, is genuinely one of the most affecting things the show ever did. And it's also, when you try to map it onto the rest of the show's timeline, a bit of a mess. Let me explain what I mean. I Remember You, which aired in Season 4, is the first episode to really establish the Simon-Marceline history with emotional clarity. In it, Ice King turns up at Marceline's home with a song he's written, and Marceline realizes, with a kind of tired sadness, that the melodies he thinks he invented are actually drawn from notes Simon left for her 1,000 years ago. The notes were an apology, written in advance, for everything the crown was going to make him do that he wouldn't be able to stop. He knew he was losing himself. He wrote to her before he forgot her. The episode frames their history as brief and intense. Simon found young Marceline in the post-war ruins, looked after her for a time while fighting the crown's influence, and then eventually lost himself completely. She never forgot him. He forgot everything. The note was the last coherent thing he managed to leave her. Then in Season 5, Simon and Marcy expands this considerably. We see the two of them together in a destroyed cityscape, traveling, surviving, Simon singing the theme from the old television program. Cheers to keep Marceline calm because it's the one thing that seems to work. He's fighting the crown's pull with every scene. He wears it when he has to fight off monsters and loses a little more of himself each time. The episode is warm and melancholy and very well made, but the two episodes imply different timescales for the same relationship. I Remember You feels like their time together was short and sharp, a few weeks maybe, before he was gone. Simon and Marcy implies something longer, a real period of cohabitation, traveling together through a world that was still actively dangerous. The show never specifies, so I can't point to a single line and say, this is the contradiction. It's more of a tonal inconsistency, the two episodes portraying the same history with different implied durations, and the emotional weight of each episode requires its own pacing. You can feel the writers of Simon and Marcy wanting to give the relationship more room, more specificity, more colour. There's also the question of how old Marceline was at the time, which is genuinely difficult to answer. In Simon and Marcy, she appears as a small child, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She's wearing a bear hat and carrying a toy and behaving like a fairly young human child would, aside from the demonic aspects. The episode establishes that she was in the post-war world, surviving before Simon found her. But Marceline is half demon. Her father is Hunson Abadir, the lord of the Nightosphere, a demon of considerable age and power. Her mother was human, and that half of her is what ages, slowly. The Distant Lands episode and the Stakes miniseries both clarify that Marceline's half-demon heritage makes her extremely long-lived, capable of surviving thousands of years before the vampirism adds true immortality. In the Farm World alternate timeline, where she was never bitten, she aged to an elderly woman over the course of more than 1,000 years. So she was still aging, but very slowly. So how old was young Marceline when Simon found her? She appeared as a child in Simon and Marcy, but given her demon heritage, she might have been a child for decades before that scene, and continued being a child for decades afterward. The show doesn't address this. She just presents as roughly 8 or 9 years old in the flashback, and we're meant to take it at face value. Now here is where things get genuinely complicated rather than just loosely sketched. In Season 3's Memory of a Memory, we see a scene of young Marceline in a flashback. This young Marceline has bite marks on her neck. 2 small punctures exactly where a vampire would bite. They're clearly visible in the scene. The problem is the timeline that Stakes establishes. Stakes is a mini-series from Season 7 that tells the complete story of how Marceline became a vampire. In that mini-series, we learn that after the Mushroom War, after the period with Simon, Marceline spent centuries roaming the post-war world, largely on her own, eventually becoming a protector of the surviving human tribes. She hunted vampires to keep the humans safe, and in the process of killing each one, she absorbed their powers. She killed the Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, the Moon, and finally, the Vampire King himself, who bit her as she slew him. She destroyed him, but she'd been bitten in the process, and she turned. The significant detail, this happened after the Simon period, after the post-war rubble, after the bear hat and the bear hugs and the cheers theme. Young Marceline with Simon was a half-demon child who had not yet been bitten by anything. She should not have bite marks in a flashback from that era. The Memory of a Memory scene was made in Season 3, well before the Stakes miniseries in Season 7 had fully worked out Marceline's biographical timeline. The bite marks on young Marceline were almost certainly drawn without the writers having committed to exactly when she was turned. When Stakes arrived and gave us the precise chronology, it inadvertently created a continuity error with that earlier scene. It's a small thing visually, easy to miss, but once you've noticed it, it's one of those details that quietly resurfaces every time you revisit those episodes. There's also the question of how the post-war world looks in different flashbacks, which isn't a plot hole in the strict sense, but contributes to a certain sense of disorientation when you try to piece the timeline together. In Simon and Marcy, the post-war landscape is grey and devastated, scattered with dangerous mutated creatures, with the occasional ruin of a city still recognisable. It's bleak in a specifically nuclear aftermath way. In Obsidian, a much later episode showing Marceline centuries after the Simon period, the world has already started filling with the magical creatures and candy landscapes that characterise Ooo in the present day. The timeline between Grey Rubble and Candy Kingdom is compressed differently in different episodes, and the world rebuilds at whatever pace the story being told requires. This isn't the writers being careless, I don't think. It's more that Adventure Time's flashback episodes were made by different writers at different points in the show's run, and each one was trying to serve the emotional needs of its own story, rather than cross-referencing a master timeline document. The result is a post-war history that feels vivid and specific in each individual episode, and somewhat vague when you try to put all the pieces together. What I keep coming back to, thinking about Simon and Marceline, is that the relationship itself is completely coherent, even when the timeline around it is not. He found her. He tried to protect her. He wrote her a note before he lost himself. She remembered him for 1,000 years, and he remembered nothing. That story is exactly what it is, regardless of whether it lasted 3 weeks or 6 months, regardless of whether the bite marks on her young self were drawn by writers who hadn't yet planned stakes. The emotional logic is airtight. The chronological logic is rather more porous. There's also a question the show touches on, but never quite answers, which is what Marceline was doing in the years between the Mushroom War and Simon and Marcy. She's a child in the post-war rubble in that episode, but she was presumably somewhere before Simon found her, living through the actual war and its immediate aftermath. Her father, Hunson Abadir, the Lord of the Nightosphere, is at this point entirely absent. In later seasons, the show gives us episodes about Marceline's complicated relationship with Hunson, his neglect of her, her anger about being abandoned. But the details of exactly when he left and where she was between the war and Simon finding her are not filled in. She has memories of being cold and alone that predate Simon. The show suggests this without dramatizing it. The Stakes miniseries, which covers Marceline's pre-vampire centuries in the most detail the show gives us, shows her as a young woman roaming Ooo and eventually protecting human survivors from vampires. This Marceline is centuries post-Simon, centuries post-war, already much older in experience than her appearance suggests. But even Stakes skips the earliest post-war years, the ones between the rubble of Simon and Marcy, and the more settled world that appears later. That period of her life, however long it was, is one of the show's significant silences. Obsidian, one of the Distant Lands specials from 2020, shows Marceline and Bubblegum's early relationship in flashback. It takes place centuries before the main series, and in it the world already looks much more like Ooo as we know it. Kingdoms, magic, various creatures living openly. The devastated grey rubble of the Simon and Marcy era is entirely gone. The world has been rebuilt. This is consistent with the premise that 1,000 years is a long time and things recover. But the speed of recovery looks quite different in different episodes, and the aesthetic of the post-war world shifts depending on what each episode needs. Simon and Marcy needs ruin for its story to work. Obsidian needs a functional world for its story to work. Both stories are true. The transition between them is simply not dramatized, which, in a show built out of grief and memory, and the way the past refuses to stay still, feels almost appropriate. Princess Bubblegum has been 18 years old, 13 years old, and approximately 800 years old, and the show has at various points presented all three of these as the correct answer. I should say up front that only one of these is a genuine plot hole in the mechanical sense. The other two are things the show eventually reconciled into a single coherent portrait of a character who is both ancient and physically young, which is an interesting thing to be, but getting there required a fairly dramatic mid-series age change that the writers clearly found uncomfortable even as they were doing it, and that discomfort is visible in how quickly they reversed it. Let me go through this in order. Seasons 1 and 2 present Princess Bubblegum as 18 years old. This is stated, or at least heavily implied, early in the show, and it establishes her as a bit older than Finn, who starts the series at 12. Finn has a crush on her. She is fond of him in a slightly distanced, elder sibling-ish way. The age gap is there to make the dynamic functional. She's the responsible one, the scientist, the ruler. He's the earnest younger kid who wants to impress her. It works. Then, Mortal Recoil happens at the end of Season 2, and things get strange. Mortal Recoil is the episode where the Lich's spirit, having escaped Finn's earlier defeat of its physical body, possesses Princess Bubblegum. Finn and the Ice King manage to stop the possession, but in the process, Bubblegum is essentially shattered, reduced to a pile of candy goo. The doctors reassemble her from what's available, but there wasn't enough of the original material. She ends up smaller. She ends up younger. She comes out of the reconstruction as 13 years old, which is, to put it gently, a choice. Finn is also 13 at this point, having aged from 12 across the first couple of seasons, so now Finn has a crush on someone who is exactly his age, and the dynamic the show had been building suddenly means something different,
and the Season 3 premiere Too Young has to deal with the consequences. In that episode, Bubblegum is 13.
Finn's feelings are encouraged, and there's a version of a romance there that the show is clearly a bit uncertain about. By the end of the episode, Bubblegum has recovered enough candy biomass, partly through Finn's earnest assistance, to restore herself to 18. The age correction happens within a single episode, and when it's done, she jokes that everything that happened feels like it was 5 years ago. That line is the show winking at the audience. The writers knew the 13 version created more problems than it solved, and they fixed it as quickly as they reasonably could while still acknowledging that it had happened. This is not the significant age inconsistency. This is just a brief detour that was acknowledged and corrected. The significant one is the third version. Across the later seasons, particularly from Season 8 onward, it's revealed that Princess Bubblegum is not 18 in any meaningful sense that maps onto human experience.
She emerged from the Mother Gum, a massive sentient blob of pink candy substance that spread through the ruins of a post-war city, roughly 800 years before the show's present day. She and her brother Neddy dropped from the Mother Gum's ceiling into an empty building and became their own persons.
She was curious and lonely and clever, and she began creating things. First her family, which did not go well, but we'll get to that, and eventually the Candy Kingdom and all its inhabitants. Rather older than 18, in other words. The Vault from Season 5 has an early nod to this, when Finn, channeling a past life, tells Bubblegum that she's not 19, you're a bazillion years old. She laughs nervously. It's played as a small joke, but it's the show beginning to acknowledge that the 18 framing is a legal fiction at best. Bonibel Bubblegum in Season 10 is the most explicit treatment of her actual origin. We see young Bonibel, centuries ago, lonely in a world that is still recovering from the Mushroom War. She creates Uncle Gumbald from candy, wanting family. She creates Aunt Lolly and Cousin Cheekle. For a while it works, and she has people around her, and she's happy in the uncomplicated way she doesn't often get to be. Then Gumbald decides he'd rather rule than be ruled,
starts scheming to take power, and Bonibel accidentally dumps a de-stupefying potion on him while trying to stop the coup. He becomes a simple candy person. Lolly and Cheekle have already been turned by him and forget who they were. She's alone again, and she declares herself princess and begins building the kingdom properly. Now, here is where the inconsistency lives. If Bubblegum built the Candy Kingdom from scratch 800 years ago, as the late season episodes clearly establish, then what are we meant to make of all the background lore from Seasons 1 and 2 that implies the kingdom has a longer history? There are paintings of what appear to be past rulers in the castle. There's a cotton candy princess whose image appears briefly. There are architectural features in the Candy Kingdom that suggest a history of construction and expansion that predates Bubblegum's personal memory. The show doesn't resolve this.
The simplest reading is that Bubblegum built or commissioned all of these things herself, including paintings of imagined predecessors, because she wanted her kingdom to feel like it had history. That would be very in character for someone who has been governing a population of candy people she created, playing the role of ruler so convincingly that for most of the show's run she seems to believe it herself. But the show never confirms this reading, so it sits there as a small, unaddressed gap. There's also the matter of Neddy. Neddy is Bubblegum's brother, who emerged from the Mother Gum at the same time she did. He's shown briefly in Bonnie and Neddy in Season 8, and the revelation is that he has been under the Candy Kingdom the entire time, for 8 seasons of the show, quietly nursing from the roots of the large tree at the center of the kingdom, producing a kind of healing juice that the Candy Kingdom uses for bathing and medicine, never mentioned, never seen.
He's not a plot hole exactly, more of a retroactive addition that makes everything slightly weirder in retrospect. He's been there the whole time. The kingdom was built around him, or perhaps because of him, with Bubblegum keeping her brother's existence private for reasons the show suggests, but doesn't fully explain. He doesn't like people. He prefers the roots and the dark. She has apparently spent 8 centuries quietly protecting him. I find something quite lovely about that, actually. And also, I find it a bit strange that he just never came up in 8 seasons of the show and then appeared in Season 8 as if he'd always been part of the furniture. Which he had, technically. Just underground. The age question for Bubblegum is one that the show itself acknowledges it can't neatly answer. The joke about being a bazillion years old is the show's way of admitting this.
She's 18 in body, 800 in experience, 13 briefly in a way that doesn't really count, and however old she feels when she's sitting alone with her science equipment at 3 in the morning, worrying about the kingdom. All of those versions of her age are simultaneously true. It's just that the earlier seasons picked one number, and the later seasons picked a different, much larger number, and the show has to live with both. What I find most interesting about the PB age question isn't the number itself, but what it implies about every scene we watch her in across the earlier seasons. There are all these episodes where Bubblegum is stressed about governing, about managing her subjects, about being a good ruler, and in those earlier episodes she reads as a very capable young woman dealing with the weight of responsibility. But once you know she's been doing this for 8 centuries, those same scenes read differently. Centuries of governing these people she made. Centuries of being the princess to subjects who don't know she invented them. Centuries of being alone with that knowledge. The Gumbald reveal is particularly interesting on rewatch because of a scene in Bonibel Bubblegum, where young Bonibel, just before everything goes wrong with her family, is genuinely happy. She's singing in her little cabin, she has her brother Neddy, she has the family she built, she has company, and then she loses it, turns them all into candy people by accident, and spends the next 8 centuries never quite getting that back. The entire Candy Kingdom, all those subjects, the whole elaborate civilization she built, is in some sense a response to the 15 minutes of happiness she had before Gumbald tried to betray her. That is, if you sit with it, rather a lot. And the show just offers this without underlining it, lets it exist as an implication rather than a stated conclusion, which is actually one of the things Adventure Time does best. There's one more piece of the PB age question that's worth sitting with briefly. In Too Young, when she jokes that the events of the episode feel like they happened 5 years ago, immediately after reverting to her proper form, this line does multiple things at once. It's a fourth wall joke, it's an acknowledgement that the 13 arc was a detour the show is glad to leave behind. But it's also, if you're paying attention, a glimpse of how someone with 8 centuries of experience would naturally process a few hours as a teenager, as something very small in a very long life, easily categorized and moved past. The humor lands. The implication underneath it is quietly enormous. Talking a bit more about the Candy Kingdom's creation, because there's a specific inconsistency here that doesn't get discussed as much as the age question, but is, I think, equally interesting. Early seasons of Adventure Time treat the Candy Kingdom as a place with history, not a deep, fleshed-out history, not the kind the show develops later, but the ambient suggestion of depth that good world-building creates. The castle has an aesthetic that implies generations of construction. There are rooms that feel lived in an old building way. Background paintings suggest prior rulers. The Candy Kingdom feels like a place that has been here for a while, layered, evolved. And then Finn, in the Season 5 episode, All Your Fault, states plainly that Princess Bubblegum made all the candy people. Not that she rules them, not that she has been governing them for a long time, that she made them, created them. This is treated as established fact by that point in the show, though it's the first time it's been said quite so directly, which raises an immediate question about all that ambient historical depth. If Bubblegum made every candy person herself, created the kingdom from scratch, built the entire edifice of candy civilization through her own effort over 8 centuries, then who built the bits that look like they came before her? The show's eventual answer, as best I can interpret it, is that Bubblegum built or commissioned all of those things herself, including the elements that give the kingdom a sense of pre-existing history. Which is, if you think about it, quite a poignant thing to do, creating an entire kingdom, filling it with subjects you made, and then also constructing the fiction of a longer history, so the whole enterprise feels grounded. So it feels like a real place rather than a science project. This reading makes Bubblegum more interesting, not less. But the show doesn't say it. The show just lets the ambient historical details sit alongside the she-built-everything revelation without addressing the tension between them. There's also the Cotton Candy Princess, who appears in a piece of background art in the castle at some point in the early seasons. She's a figure who seems to predate Bubblegum's reign, or at least presents that way visually. The fandom has theories about her, that she was a previous incarnation of the Candy Elemental, that she was an earlier experiment of Bubblegum's, that she was a figure Bubblegum created as part of the fictional history she built for her kingdom. The show has never confirmed any of these readings. She's just there in the background, looking royal, unexplained. The question of what the candy people actually are is its own small tangle.
Bubblegum created them, the show establishes.
They're made of candy. They can die, they can reproduce, they have internal lives and relationships and jobs. They're people in every sense that matters. But are they the same kind of alive as Bubblegum herself, who emerged from a sentient substance and developed consciousness of her own? Or are they made beings, constructed rather than born? The show is deliberately soft on this because it doesn't want to draw a hard line between different kinds of life in Ooo, which is one of the things that makes Adventure Time philosophically interesting. But the softness means that the question of what Bubblegum's relationship to her subject actually is, whether she's their ruler or something more like their creator deity, never gets a clean answer. She created them, she governs them, she genuinely cares about them, and they have no idea that their entire civilization is one woman's response to being lonely in a ruined world centuries before any of them existed. That's rather a lot to be sitting on. The Gumbald story, which Bonibel Bubblegum delivers in full, doesn't technically create a plot hole, but it does create a retrospective layer that affect earlier episodes in ways the show doesn't fully process. If Gumbald has been a candy person since before the kingdom was properly established, and Bubblegum has been carrying the knowledge of how she accidentally turned him all these centuries, then every scene in the early seasons where she acts like a benevolent princess managing a normal kingdom has a hidden context that the audience was unaware of. There's a version of early Bubblegum who is also quietly managing the weight of having turned her family into furniture.
The show can't go back and add that layer retroactively, so it just exists as an implication that hangs in the air. One more detail worth mentioning before we move on. The candy juice that runs through the kingdom's infrastructure, the substance used for bathing and for its healing properties, comes from Neddy. He's been producing it by nursing from the tree for 8 centuries. Every resident of the Candy Kingdom has, without knowing it, been bathing in something that comes from the princess's secret brother. This is presented in the show as a warm, sweet piece of lore, and it is.
It's also quite a lot to process if you sit with it for long enough. There's a broader question sitting underneath the Candy Kingdom's creation that the show never quite brings itself to address directly. If Bubblegum made the candy people, created them from her own imagination and candy matter and something we might as well call care, then what does it mean that they can die? They do die. Candy people get hurt, get sick, expire. They have funerals. They age, some of them. They have children, which implies some kind of biological reproduction that Bubblegum didn't directly supervise. At some point, the Candy People became something that happened on its own, a civilization that generates new members without their creator's involvement. When did that start? The show doesn't say. It does say that Candy People explode when frightened, which is established in the very first episode and remains a running feature of the show. The Candy Kingdom has this built-in catastrophic vulnerability. A sufficiently scared population could destroy itself. Bubblegum spends considerable effort across the series managing her subjects' emotional states for this reason, which is both responsible governance and also rather paternalistic, and the show is aware of this tension. She creates, she governs, she protects, and the line between care and control is not always clean. All Your Fault from Season 5 gives us the Lemongrab brothers, created by Bubblegum as a failed heir before the kingdom was established, the timeline is a bit vague, who have been locked in Castle Lemongrab, eating everything in it, including all the lemon people she created. The episode is deeply strange and rather horrifying in places, but it also reveals something about Bubblegum as a creator. She makes things, and then she takes responsibility for them, even when they turn out badly, even when they're producing lemon people who are subsequently consumed by their lord in a situation that is clearly not fine. She made them. She has to deal with them to deal. This is one of the things I find genuinely fascinating about Bubblegum as a character. She has been doing this for centuries. She built a civilization, she has made terrible mistakes and good ones, and maintained responsibility for all of them. And she is still, at the end of all of this, calling herself a princess and going to science fairs. And there's one more layer to this that the show adds in Season 9, touching on the elemental mythology that developed in later seasons. Bubblegum is revealed to be the current incarnation of the Candy Elemental, a fundamental cosmic force that has existed in various forms throughout Oo's history. This is established in Season 9 and retroactively makes her creation of the Candy Kingdom into something more than a personal response to loneliness. She was, in some sense, fulfilling a cosmic function. The Candy Elemental's nature draws candy into being. She didn't just decide to create candy people, she was constitutionally drawn to do it.
This is an interesting framework that the show doesn't quite reconcile with the biography of lonely young Bonnibel sitting in a cabin deciding to make her family. The elemental reading makes her actions feel fated, impersonal, cosmically necessary. The biographical reading makes them feel deeply human, the particular response of a particular person to a particular kind of loneliness. Both are presented as true. The show is content to hold them in tension without choosing between them, which is a very Adventure Time thing to do. Whether the candy people themselves have any knowledge of or relationship with Bubblegum's elemental nature is never addressed. They know she's their princess. Some of them know she created them. Whether they know she's a fundamental force of the universe, wearing a tiara and doing chemistry experiments, is left, like so many things, to the imagination. One of Adventure Time's foundational premises, present from the very first episode, is that Finn is the last human being in the Land of Ooo. This is stated directly, treated as integral to his identity, and used to explain why he's unusual and why the show's world finds him remarkable. He is the last of his kind. He is a rarity. He matters in part because humans used to exist, and now they don't, except for him. It's a good premise, and for the first several seasons, it functions well. And then the show progressively undoes it, piece by piece, over the course of about 7 seasons, until by the time Islands arrives in Season 8, it's fairly clear that Finn was never actually the last human, just the last one in this particular corner of the map. Let me trace how this happens, because it's interesting to watch. The first complication arrives in Season 2 with Susan Strong, an episode where Finn discovers a tribe of underground creatures he calls Hyumans, who look something like humans, act something like humans, and wear animal hats that he initially assumes are costumes. He's hopeful, desperately so, in the way that someone who believes they're alone and suddenly finds a possible companion would be. But the Hyumans turn out to be fish-human hybrids, mutants who developed from humans affected by the Mushroom War's fallout. Close, but not quite. Susan herself, the Hyuman leader, is different from the others. There's something about her, some behavioral pattern, some physical quality, that suggests she might be more fully human than the tribe she leads. The show teases this and doesn't answer it for several seasons. Season 7's Dark Purple finally confirms it. Susan is a real human. She has a cybernetic implant in her head, placed there by someone, that has been suppressing her memories. When Finn destroys the implant, she has a moment of returning to herself before the signal it sends triggers something larger. She's human. She came from somewhere. Someone sent her to find Finn, and then Islands, the Season 8 miniseries, gives us the full picture.
About 1,000 years before the show's present day, in the immediate aftermath of the Mushroom War, a group of surviving humans fled the mainland on a container ship. They were running from the vampires, the oozers, and all the other dangers that had begun filling the ruined world. They found an isolated archipelago and settled there. Over the following millennium, they built a technically sophisticated society, a kind of post-apocalyptic utopia with clean water and medicine and schools and structure, entirely cut off from the magical chaos of Ooo. The islands are stable and safe and deeply isolated. Finn was born there. His mother Minerva Campbell was a helper on the islands, someone whose job was to care for the community. His father Martin Mertens was a wanderer, a man with a complicated past who was eventually pursued by something called the Guardian, a massive automated defender that the island society had built to keep outsiders out and residents in. Martin, trying to escape the Guardian with baby Finn, was forced to make a choice. He left the baby on a raft. The raft drifted to Ooo. Finn washed up and was eventually found and raised by a dog named Joshua and his wife Margaret. So Finn was never actually the last human. There were, the whole time, a community of humans living on islands not that far away. He was simply a human who had been separated from all the other humans, and the people of Ooo assumed that the total absence of humans they were familiar with meant there were no humans left. Now, the show clearly planned this reveal in advance, or at least in the middle advance. There are hints scattered across earlier seasons that build toward it. The question of where Finn came from was always going to need an answer. So this isn't exactly a plot hole in the way that some of the other things I'm talking about tonight are. It's more of a premise that was always going to be complicated by the show's own ambitions, but the early seasons present the last human idea with such conviction that it's clear how fully it's been revised by the end. Every scene in seasons 1 through 6 where characters express wonder or sadness at Finn being the only human left is technically incorrect. and was incorrect at the time of filming, because there were hundreds of humans on Hub Island being quietly guarded by a robotic entity. Finn's father Martin is a separate complication. He's introduced in Season 6 as a selfish, charming, fundamentally unreliable man who genuinely doesn't seem to care much about his son in any actionable way.
He uses Finn repeatedly for his own convenience and then disappears. The emotional story of Finn processing his father's absence and indifference is one of the show's most honestly painful threads, and it's handled with real care. But Martin's backstory, when the Islands miniseries delivers it, is a bit rushed and leaves several questions sitting unanswered. Why was he being pursued by the Guardian? What was his actual crime? What was his relationship with Minerva like before everything went wrong? The show gives us the broad strokes and moves on, because the story it cares about is Finn's processing, not Martin's biography. That's a reasonable choice, but it does mean that one of the main secondary characters has a significant chunk of personal history that the audience never fully learns. Finn's age across the show's run is, incidentally, one of the things Adventure Time actually handles more honestly than most animated series. He starts at 12, ages visibly across 10 seasons to 17, and in Distant Lands, Together Again, set long after the main series, he's shown as an elderly man at the end of a full human life. The show committed to aging its protagonist, which is unusual and I think commendable, and it mostly tracks correctly. There are a few seasons where you might squint at the timeline, but the overall arc from 12 to elderly is consistent. One last thing about humans in Ooo before we move on.
The show, after the Islands miniseries, establishes that the human community eventually returns to the mainland at Finn's encouragement. The physical isolation is ended. Humans and the magical world of Ooo can now meet. This is treated as a resolution, an opening of a closed door. And then the show, more or less, doesn't deal with the consequences of this for its remaining episodes. Because there weren't that many left by that point, the humans come back to Ooo, and then the show wraps up without fully exploring what that means. A thread picked up and then set down again before anyone could properly sit with it. The Martin problem is worth a bit more attention than I gave it earlier. He's a character who gets a fairly detailed episode in The Visitor, which arrives in Season 7 and shows Martin in the present day, living on a planet with a creature that's been feeding off his guilt. The episode is meant to clarify his relationship with Finn. He clearly cares about Finn in some form, isn't entirely indifferent, but he has spent his whole life rationalizing flight over responsibility, and he keeps doing it. He leaves again. He always leaves. The Islands miniseries shows us his past on Hub Island and why he was being pursued by the Guardian. He had been helping a hider, one of the people who wanted to leave the islands against the society's rules, and was himself trying to leave when the Guardian caught up with him. His crime, such as it was involvement in an act of freedom that the island society had decided to prohibit. This reframes him slightly, and the show uses this reframing to suggest that Martin isn't entirely without principles. He just has principles that consistently result in him leaving. The detail that always catches me is the Guardian itself. The island society built a massive automated defender to prevent people from leaving. This is presented as a safety measure, the humans protecting themselves from the dangerous world outside. It's also, if you're being precise about it, a prison. The humans chose to be safe, and they built something to make sure no one could change their mind about it. Minerva, Finn's mother, who eventually understands this and helps dismantle the Guardian's controlling function, is the show's way of acknowledging this tension without making it a simple story about freedom versus safety. Susan's full arc, from mysterious human leader to revealed human to messenger from the islands, is one of the show's quieter, long games. She appears in Season 2, and her true identity isn't confirmed until Season 7, which is 5 years of real time and about 5 seasons of story. The show was planning this, or at least planning to give it an answer of some kind, for a very long time. Susan ends up being one of the few human characters who chooses, at the end of Islands, to stay on the mainland and explore rather than return to the island. The others mostly go back. Susan goes forward. It suits her. Jake is a magic dog. This is established in the show's first episode and treated as self-evident for several seasons. He can stretch, he can shrink, he can grow to enormous sizes, change the shape of his body into complex structures, become a house or a bridge or a submarine. He has no explanation for this, and neither does anyone else in the show's world. He's just magic, the way some dogs apparently are in Ooo. I want to note, before getting into the retcon, that this was actually fine. Not every ability needs an origin story. Jake's powers being unexplained suited the show's early tone, which was more interested in what was fun and surprising than in what was consistent and documented. A magic dog is a perfectly reasonable inhabitant of Adventure Time's post-apocalyptic fairy tale world.
But then the show decided to give Jake an origin story anyway, and it is, even by Adventure Time standards, quite a lot. The specific episode is Joshua and Margaret Investigations from Season 7, a flashback episode showing Jake's parents before he was born. Joshua and Margaret were detectives, both dogs, both adventurous in a way that clearly prefigures their sons. In the course of an investigation, Joshua is bitten on the head by a creature called Warren Ampersand. Warren is described as an alien shapeshifter who has been traveling the world looking for a compatible host species to breed with. He infects Joshua with something, implants something via the bite, and then disappears. Later, Margaret gives birth to a puppy. This is Jermaine, the brother Finn and Jake occasionally mention, but rarely see. And then, from a bump on Joshua's head, a second creature emerges. This is Jake. Jake came out of a lump on his father's head. He is, at least in part, the offspring of an alien parasite. His stretchy powers are not magic, or not merely magic. They come from Warren Ampersand's DNA, transmitted through Joshua's infection, expressing in Jake as the ability to reshape his body at will. Warren's long-term plan, it turns out, was to eventually return and harvest Jake's stretchy abilities for himself, which he nearly manages before Jake throws him into a black hole. So Jake is not a magic dog. He is a hybrid, the son of a normal magical dog and the genetic legacy of an alien shapeshifter, and his fundamental ability to stretch and transform comes from extraterrestrial biology. This is the sort of reveal that Adventure Time does regularly, where something that seemed like charming background whimsy turns out to have a precise and rather strange explanation. And the explanation works on its own terms. The episode is warm and well made. Jake's complicated reaction to learning his true origin is handled with appropriate weight, and Warren himself is a genuinely interesting villain. The problem is that for 6 seasons, Jake's powers were presented in ways that imply they work by magic rules rather than biological ones. The limits on his abilities, when the show acknowledges that limits exist, are framed in terms of willpower, concentration, and physical exhaustion rather than in terms of inherited biological capacity. In The Limit, from Season 2, he stretches himself so thin across a dungeon that he's in physical agony and genuinely at risk of dying, which suggests his powers have real physical constraints. In other episodes, he transforms into a house large enough for multiple people, flies by inflating himself, and undergoes rapid changes in mass and density that don't seem constrained by anything in particular. The Warren Ampersand origin doesn't break these moments, exactly. Alien biology could work on its own rules, but it does retroactively impose a framework on Jake's powers that the show hadn't been using, and that doesn't quite match the impression those earlier seasons create. There's also the question of what the revelation means for Jake, and here the show's handling is honestly one of its more interesting choices. Jake finds out he's partly alien. He processes this, talks about it, decides he's still himself regardless of where his powers came from. The conversation he has about identity in the aftermath of meeting Warren is brief but genuine, the show acknowledging that origin doesn't dictate selfhood. Then he moves on. He doesn't become a different character. He's still Jake, warm, a bit lazy, deeply loyal, occasionally wise in ways that surprise him. That's actually quite a mature thing for the show to do, refusing to let a dramatic origin story redefine a character who had been consistently himself for 6 seasons. I appreciate it. It's just that the retroactive origin still sits slightly awkwardly against the earlier seasons that had no use for it. Jake and Lady Rainicorn's 5 children are their own small continuity oddity. The pups are born, grow to adulthood, and effectively move out within what feels like days from Finn and Jake's perspective. Though again, the show's floating timeline makes this genuinely hard to pin down. By the time they appear later, they're fully adult beings with distinct personalities. Charlie, who can see the future, Viola, who is artistic, Kim Kil-Wan, who is intensely businesslike in a way that seems to mystify his father, and so on. They're entertaining in their brief appearances. They're also children of 2 main characters who received approximately no screen time during their actual childhood. The show acknowledges this mostly through Jake being bemused by how different they turned out from his expectations. There's also Jermaine, Jake's older brother, who exists for most of the series as a briefly mentioned sibling, who Jake clearly has some unresolved feelings about. He appears properly in Season 7's Jermaine, which explores the dynamic between them, the way Jermaine felt burdened by responsibility while Jake escaped it, the old resentment that comes with being the one who stayed.
It's a good episode and it gives Jermaine genuine depth, but Jermaine also demonstrates no stretchy powers whatsoever. He is, as far as the show presents him, a completely ordinary dog. No alien DNA expressing in his biology, no shape-shifting. This is odd given the Warren ampersand retcon. If Jake's powers come from Warren's DNA, transmitted through Joshua's infection, and Jermaine is Joshua's biological son, born in the conventional way, then why doesn't Jermaine have any version of those powers? The retcon gives Jake an alien biological heritage, without addressing why his brother who shares the same father has nothing of the sort. The show's implied answer might be that the infection expressed specifically in Jake because of how he was born, that the bump on the head birth somehow concentrated the alien genetic material in a way that conventional birth didn't allow.
But the show doesn't say this, it just leaves Jermaine as an ordinary dog and Jake as the alien parasite boy, without commenting on the discrepancy. I don't think this was oversight. I think the show was genuinely more interested in what Jake's origin meant emotionally, the question of identity and inheritance, and whether where you came from defines who you are, than in sorting out the precise genetics. But the loose end sits there. One specific moment in the show's treatment of Jake's powers that I keep coming back to is in The New Frontier, from Season 3. Jake has a prophetic dream about his own death, a very specific death involving a space vessel, and spends much of the episode believing it is inevitable and at peace with this. The episode is meditative and quiet, in a way that Adventure Time does occasionally, and it treats Jake's acceptance of mortality as genuine wisdom. But it also, in that same episode, shows Jake capable of a very elaborate transformation and quite precise control of his abilities. The tension between Jake's powers have real limits and exhaust him, and Jake's powers work at whatever scale the scene needs, is never quite resolved across the show's run. You could read this as Jake having learned to use them more effectively over time, having grown into his alien heritage without knowing that's what it was. Or you could read it as the writers using his powers as a narrative convenience that gets more convenient as the show's ambitions expand. Both readings have some supporting evidence. What strikes me most about the Warren ampersand revelation, honestly, is less the mechanics of it, and more what it says about the show's relationship to its own earlier seasons. For 6 years Jake was a magic dog, because this was a world where magic dogs existed, and no further explanation was needed or wanted. The show was comfortable with that, and then, in Season 7, it decided that wasn't enough, that Jake's nature needed grounding in something more specific. The result is a richer biography and a slightly looser set of early episodes, which is perhaps the inevitable cost of giving a character more history than they were originally designed to carry. Marceline the Vampire Queen has more distinct abilities than almost anyone else in Adventure Time, and the rules governing those abilities have been quietly renegotiated several times across the show's run in ways that add up to a portrait of a character whose mythology was genuinely being assembled in real time. Start with sunlight, since it's the most fundamental vampire constraint and the one the show handles most inconsistently. Marceline is, without question, adversely affected by direct sunlight. This is established early and remains consistent throughout.
She lives in caves or indoors, comes out at night, wears full coverage clothing when she has to be outside during the day. In several episodes, brief sun exposure is shown to genuinely hurt her, causing discomfort or physical reactions that she has to recover from. Good. Simple. A vampire thing. But the severity of the effect varies considerably depending on the scene. In some episodes, a brief flash of sunlight is clearly painful, and she flinches away or recoils. In others, she's walking through spaces with heavy but indirect light, or standing near large windows at dusk without apparent difficulty. The show is inconsistent about whether diffused light counts, whether duration matters, whether her half-demon biology provides any resilience that her vampirism doesn't. The answer seems to be whatever the scene needs, which is not technically an answer.
Then there's the feeding question, which is more interesting and more directly contradictory. In early episodes, Marceline is established as not a typical vampire in the blood-drinking sense. She feeds on the colour red. She'll drink red out of a strawberry, drain the red from a tomato, eat red candy. In Season 1's Evicted, She describes her diet in these terms, and it's played as a charming quirk that distinguishes her from the scary vampire archetype. She's a vampire who doesn't drink blood. She drinks the essence of a colour. This is the show being pleasantly strange. Then, Red Starved arrives in Season 6. Marceline, Finn and Jake are trapped underground, and Marceline has been deprived of anything red for some time. She begins to lose control. She enters what the episode calls a feral mode, where she becomes genuinely dangerous, unable to regulate her behaviour, driven by what is clearly a physical craving for blood rather than for a colour. She has to be restrained.
It's a serious episode that treats her vampirism as a genuine curse with real consequences. This is more than just the colour red includes the red in blood. The episode establishes that blood specifically has a quality that satisfies the vampire need in a way that coloured food does not. The colour red thing was always a workaround, a coping mechanism Marceline had developed, not a genuine substitute. Now, this is not an incoherent revision. In fact, it enriches the character considerably. She's been spending centuries pretending she doesn't need blood because she doesn't want to be the monster that drinking blood would make her feel like. That's interesting and sad. But it does mean that the early seasons' framing of her as a vampire who doesn't drink blood, she just drinks the colour red, was, within the show's own world, a polite fiction that Marceline was telling herself and others. And the show never quite acknowledges this shift directly.
Stakes, the Season 7 miniseries, adds another layer to this. We learn that Marceline's vampiric abilities are not a single package she received when she was turned. They came piecemeal. When she was hunting vampires before being turned herself, she was absorbing the unique powers of each vampire she killed via her demon heritage. The ability to become a bat. From the Fool, the power of hypnosis and glamour. From the Empress, the healing factor and endurance. From the Moon, her shapeshifting into a large creature, also from absorbed powers. The Vampire King's bite gave her true vampirism and the full weight of that condition, but her individual abilities were assembled from 5 different vampires she had already destroyed. This is a brilliant piece of retroactive lore that makes Marceline's power set make more sense in terms of internal logic. The problem is that it was invented in Season 7, and the show doesn't attempt to retrofit the earlier seasons. There are moments in Seasons 1 through 6 where Marceline uses abilities that this framework would attribute to specific vampires she absorbed, but the show never acknowledges that those abilities came from somewhere particular. They were just vampire things Marceline does, and now they're things she absorbed from 5 specific vampires she killed centuries ago. The bones of the story fit, but the flesh had to be added later. And then there's the bite mark issue from Memory of a Memory that I mentioned in an earlier section, which I won't re-explain in full, but is worth flagging here. Young Marceline in the Simon-era flashback has bite marks that shouldn't exist at that point in her timeline. Small detail, but persistent.
Marceline's flying is one of those things I find myself genuinely uncertain about. She flies in her bat form, which is a vampire power via the Fool. But she also appears to hover and levitate in various non-bat scenes throughout the show in ways that suggest general flight ability independent of transformation. Is this the demon heritage? Vampire levitation separate from the bat form? The show never specifies. Marceline just kind of floats when the scene calls for it, which is charming but not technically coherent with the specific powers from specific vampires' framework. Hunson Abadir is his own question mark. He's Marceline's father, the Lord of the Nightosphere, a demon of considerable age and power, who is also in his way quite a funny character. He shows up in It Came from the Nightosphere, wanting to absorb souls and also to have a relationship with his daughter, both of which he pursues simultaneously and with equal conviction. He's neglectful and dangerous and also clearly loves Marceline in whatever way a demon lord is capable of loving a person. The show uses him mainly to explore Marceline's father issues, which are substantial, and to suggest that Marceline's half-demon nature gives her abilities and resilience that ordinary vampires don't have. But it never quite clarifies the hierarchy of her powers. Is her demon nature the foundation and the vampirism built on top of it? Or did the vampirism essentially overwrite her demon heritage in terms of practical ability? The stakes answer that her demon nature is what allowed her to absorb other vampires' powers suggests the former. She's a demon who became a vampire, not a vampire who happens to have demon blood. But the show's early seasons treat her vampirism as the primary fact of her existence and her demon heritage as an additional detail, and the two frameworks don't quite harmonize. The color red feeding is worth dwelling on a bit longer, because I think it's genuinely one of the show's most revealing retroactive inconsistencies. When Marceline says in season 1 that she doesn't drink blood, just absorbs the red from things, the scene is played for charm. It suggests she's found a way to live with her vampirism that doesn't require her to be a predator, a monster, the thing she's been fighting against in herself since long before she became one. But Red Starved in season 6 shows us that this was never quite true, or was never a permanent solution. The physical craving for blood when she's deprived long enough is not something you can manage through a workaround of strawberry juice forever.
Her body knows what it needs, and eventually, her body demands it. The color red feeding was a way of being kind to herself, and to others, and it worked up to a point. The point is apparently several weeks of underground confinement, without access to anything red at all. What I find interesting is that neither episode is wrong about Marceline. The first episode shows who she's trying to be. The later episode shows what the cost of that identity is. If you read them as a sequence rather than as contradictions, they're actually quite a complete portrait of what living with the vampire nature looks like for someone who has decades of practice at it. There's one more dimension of Marceline's character that I want to mention, which is the question of why she wanted to stop being a vampire in the first place, since this is central to the Stakes miniseries and is never quite answered to my satisfaction. She goes to Bubblegum and asks to have her vampirism removed. She says she's tired of it, that she wants to grow up, which is a poignant phrase for someone who is roughly 1,000 years old. But the specifics of why now, what particular thing made this the moment, aren't stated. She has been a vampire for most of her existence. She has built a life around it, however deliberately strange that life has been. The decision to want out feels emotionally true, but causally unclear. The Stakes miniseries answers the consequences of the decision, and does so beautifully, but it doesn't quite answer the motivation. What it does suggest, through the events of the miniseries, and through Marceline's eventual reacceptance of her vampire nature, is that the real question wasn't whether she was a vampire, but whether she was afraid of what that meant. The vampirism was never the problem. The problem was a particular relationship to her own history and her own power that the miniseries helps her resolve. She comes out the other side as a vampire who has chosen to be one, rather than a vampire who simply is one. That's a meaningful distinction, and the show earns it. It just takes a slightly winding path to get there, one that requires the audience to do some inferential work about what the decision to seek removal actually meant, since the show itself is more interested in the journey than in the starting conditions. The Lich is the closest thing Adventure Time has to a traditional villain. He is ancient, implacable, and interested in exactly one thing: the extinction of all life everywhere. He has been a presence in the world since before the Mushroom War, imprisoned by the hero Billy, and freed by accident at the end of Season 2. He is repeatedly described as the most dangerous being in existence. He eventually kills Prismo, an essentially omnipotent entity who exists outside of time. He destroys the Crystal Citadel, a cosmic prison built to contain the most dangerous criminals in the entire multiverse. He is also, in his first major appearance, defeated by a knitted sweater. I want to be careful here, because the sweater defeat is not actually a plot hole. It's entirely intentional. The sweater is explicitly imbued with the emotional force of Bubblegum's affection for Finn, described in the show as the power of liking someone a lot, and this emotional power is presented as capable of resisting the Lich's mind control. The defeat works on an internal logic that Adventure Time embraces fully and without apology. Love and care and the force of human connection are powerful things in Ooo. A sweater made with genuine feeling can stop a death god. The show means this. What changes across the following seasons is the scale of the Lich's power, which expands dramatically, and the question of how he could ever have been vulnerable to a sweater in the first place becomes increasingly difficult to answer. Let me trace the Lich's trajectory. His hero, Season 1, shows us in flashback that Billy the hero defeated the Lich and sealed him in amber. Billy is a large man with great physical strength and a history of heroic deeds. He punches things and they break. He punched the Lich and sealed him in a glob of amber in a tree in the Candy Kingdom. This is how Ooo has been safe for so long. Mortal Folly and Mortal Recoil, the Season 2 finale, introduce the Lich properly. He is frightening, genuinely so, but his frightening qualities are fairly grounded. He controls minds. He can decay things he touches. He's building up to his full power at his well of power. Finn stops him with the sweater. The Lich's spirit survives in Princess Bubblegum's body and is eventually driven out into the snail. He is defeated but present. In seasons 3 and 4, the Lich skulks in the possessed snail, appearing in every episode as a background detail, watching, waiting, building towards something larger.
His power level in this form is limited, which makes sense for a disembodied spirit living in a small invertebrate. The waiting has a purpose. He needs Billy's body and the Enchiridion to access the multiverse. By season 5, he has done this. He makes a wish for the extinction of all life. He accesses the Time Room, the domain of Prismo, who is essentially a god in the Adventure Time cosmology. The Lich is operating at a completely different scale now. He's not a powerful monster, he's a cosmological force. Season 6's Wake Up and Escape from the Citadel are where the scale tips entirely. The Lich kills Prismo, who was a being capable of granting any wish, who existed outside normal time, who was functionally omnipotent within his domain. The Lich does this with apparent ease. Then he is taken to the Crystal Citadel, a prison that exists outside reality and holds the worst criminals across all of space and time. He destroys it, he frees everyone inside.
This is not the Lich from season 2. This is not a monster that struggles with a hero in amber. This is something that operates at a level where Billy's punches or a warm sweater should not have ever been relevant. The Comet in season 6 then provides the retroactive explanation. The Lich was originally a catalyst comet, a cyclical force that travels to worlds to bring profound change. In his case, the change he brings is death. He's not just an ancient wizard, he is a fundamental cosmic principle wearing a rotted body. He existed as a force before the concept of life and death had physical forms. This is the show expanding the mythology in a way that is genuinely interesting, but that creates a scale problem it cannot fully resolve. If the Lich is a cosmic principle older than existence, why was he ever imprisoned in amber by a man who punches things?
Why did he need to spend seasons 3 and 4 skulking in a snail, slowly working toward a plan to access the multiverse when he had apparently killed a wish-granting god by season 5?
The show's implicit answer seems to be that the Lich's power waxes and wanes based on circumstances, that his well of power in the Mushroom War rubble was what originally gave him his physical strength, and that he was much diminished after Billy's defeat. The cosmic scale only became available to him again once he had positioned himself correctly and found the access points he needed. This is a reasonable reading, but the show gives you the pieces to assemble this reading yourself rather than ever stating it clearly, and then, having expanded the Lich to cosmic horror levels, the show turns him into a baby. At the end of Escape from the Citadel, a healing agent from one of the Citadel Guardians splashes onto the Lich and transforms him. The most dangerous being in the multiverse, a cosmic principle of death, becomes Sweet Pea, a large, gentle,
confused toddler who is subsequently adopted by Tree Trunks and Mr. Pig and raised in a happy home with a wagon and some pigs. The Lich's essence is still inside Sweet Pea, and Whispers in season 9 deals with what happens when it begins to wake up. Sweet Pea defeats it, not through power, not through cosmic intervention, but through refusing to be afraid of it, through looking at the darkness inside himself and simply deciding not to become it. The show's conclusion about the greatest evil in Adventure Time's universe is that it can be overcome by a child's self-acceptance. This is the show at its most earnest, and I find it entirely winning. It is also, if you're keeping track of the Lich's established power level, slightly hard to reconcile with the entity that destroyed a multiversal prison about 12 episodes earlier. There's something worth saying about what the Sweater defeat is actually doing before we move any further. The show is not being naive in that scene. It knows what it's doing. The whole premise of the Lich as an embodiment of pure destruction is that destruction has no immunity to creation, to care, to the small acts of making that define living things. A sweater, knitted with genuine feeling, defeats a death god because death has no defense against the specific thing that makes life worth protecting. That's not really an inconsistency, that's the show's thesis statement, made small enough to fit in a sleeve. It just becomes harder to hold that reading intact when the same death god is casually murdering omnipotent wish granters a few seasons later. The metaphysical meaning of the Sweater defeat was always meant to transcend the literal power levels involved. By Season 6, the literal power levels have become so astronomical that the metaphysical framing has to work considerably harder to stay in frame.
The Sweet Pea arc is the show's attempt at offering the Lich a resolution other than simple defeat, and it is, genuinely, one of the show's most interesting ideas. He doesn't get destroyed, he becomes something new. Tree Trunks and Mr. Pig raise him as their son, which is itself a fairly strange domestic arrangement, but Gold Stars from Season 9 handles it with real care. Sweet Pea, by that episode, is a real child. He has nightmares about being the Lich, has blackouts where something ancient and frightening briefly surfaces, is frightened of what he might be capable of, and in Whispers, when the inner Lich finally demands to be confronted, Sweet Pea defeats it by accepting his own fear rather than running from it. This is adventure time at its most earnest and also at its most philosophically ambitious. The answer to an entity of cosmic destruction is not to destroy it, but to give it a life with enough love in it that the destruction loses its grip. Whether that holds up as a cosmological proposition is separate from whether it works emotionally, and it works enormously. Sweet Pea is a wonderful character. The gap between cosmic destroyer of all life and a large gentle toddler with a nice family is, however, one the audience is invited to simply leap across without a great deal of bridge building, and it remains the most striking tonal transition the show ever attempted. The Fionna and Cake episodes of Adventure Time start life as a bit. Ice King writes fanfiction about gender-swapped versions of the characters he knows, and the show presents one of these stories as a full episode. Fionna the human girl, and Cake the magic cat going on adventures in a world that looks like Ooo, but softer and more romance-forward. It's a piece of wish fulfillment Ice King has written for himself. It's played for comedy. The episode is fun and self-aware, and doesn't take itself terribly seriously. And then the show kept making them. Bad Little Boy in Season 5. The Prince Who Wanted Everything in Season 6, each one a bit more detailed than the last, each one giving the alternate world a little more texture. The Fionna and Cake world accumulates gravity across these episodes, even as the framing insists it's just something a lonely, deluded wizard wrote to feel better about himself, by the time of 5 short tables in which various characters encounter Ice King's manuscripts. The joke has already stretched to accommodate something a bit strange. Ice King's writing is improbably good, too detailed, too emotionally coherent. He's invented a world that has independent integrity, full characters with inner lives, a history that doesn't quite match Ooo, but rhymes with it. The Marcy/Marshall Lee section of his stories in particular has a sensitivity about Marceline that Ice King in his present state shouldn't quite have access to.
The show is, I think, quietly suggesting that the Fionna and Cake world comes from somewhere deeper than Ice King's conscious imagination, that the crown, which has been warping his mind and his perception of reality for centuries, might have given him access to something real, but the show doesn't say this directly in the original run. Then the Fionna and Cake spin-off, released in 2023 on Max, makes it explicit. Simon Petrikov, post-Crown, is trying to reconnect with Betty, who merged with Golb at the end of the main series finale. He performs a magical ritual that goes wrong in an interesting way. Instead of contacting Betty, he accidentally pulls Fionna and Cake themselves through from their universe, which turns out to be a real place that has been existing in the multiverse all along, hidden inside the Crown's magic. The Fionna and Cake world was real. It just wasn't accessible until Simon inadvertently tore a hole in the wall between it and Ooo.
This is a retroactive reclassification of everything from the original series Fionna and Cake episodes. They weren't Ice King's fanfiction, they were his subconscious perception of a real alternate universe, filtered through centuries of insanity and expressed as stories he thought he was making up, which is actually a more interesting answer than a deranged ice wizard writes very good prose. But it creates a question the spin-off doesn't fully address. When did the Fionna world become real? Was it always real and Ice King had some kind of unconscious access to it via the crown? Did the crown create it, the way the farm world was accidentally created by a wish?
Was it one of countless parallel realities that was always there, only becoming significant when its connection to Simon's mind was discovered? The spin-off introduces a character called Scarab, an auditor who works for some unnamed cosmic authority who is hunting Fionna and Cake because their universe is unauthorized, an exception that shouldn't exist. This implies there's a system of authorized and unauthorized realities which is a genuinely interesting concept, but the show doesn't explain it in any depth before the season ends. There's also the Winter King, an alternate universe version of Ice King, who appears in the spin-off as an antagonist. He removed the crown's curse by transferring it to his world's Princess Bubblegum, turning her into the Candy Queen, a being of enormous power and suppressed grief. He got to be Simon again. She got the curse. He considers this an acceptable arrangement. The interesting thing about the Winter King is that his method, transferring the curse rather than enduring it, implies that the Ice Crown's corrupting influence can be passed between wearers in a targeted way, that the corruption is not inherent to the crown itself, but is a transferable property that can be redirected. This is never suggested in the original series. The crown is presented throughout Adventure Time as something that happens to its wearer, not something that can be deliberately aimed at someone else. The Winter King's ability to do what he did requires a mechanism that the main show didn't establish. Marceline, the gender-swapped Marceline equivalent from the Fionna world, is worth a brief mention here. In Ice King's original stories, Marceline was clearly a projection of his own understanding of Marceline, shaped by his feelings for her, his residual guilt about abandoning her, his complicated affection that the crown had twisted into something he couldn't express normally. In the spin-off, Marceline is an independent being with his own history and his own relationship with the alternate Fionna. He still rhymes with Marceline in obvious ways. He's still a vampire musician with complicated feelings about belonging. But he's no longer anyone's projection. He's his own person now, which required the show to carry a character from one context to a completely different one without letting the seams show too obviously. Fionna herself is interesting in the spin-off in a way she was never quite given the space to be in the original series, where she was always, in some sense, an idealization.
Ice King's version of her was brave and capable, and surrounded by people who admired her. The spin-off, Fionna, is someone who feels stuck, who works a dead-end job, who has not quite managed to become the person she feels she should be. She's ordinary in a way the original episode's version of her couldn't be, because the original version existed in Ice King's imagination, and imagined people are always slightly more than real ones. This is, again, a retroactive enrichment rather than a contradiction, but it does require the audience to file the original Fionna and Cake episodes in a different mental folder than the spin-off to understand that the Fionna we meet in Season 3 of the original show is not quite the same being as the Fionna we follow across the spin-off. Even though the spin-off tells us they are versions of the same person, the Ice King's perception of her was coloured by everything the crown had done to his understanding of women and relationships and love. The Fionna who actually exists in the multiverse is someone his distorted perception happened to approximate without fully capturing. There's also a question the spin-off raises and doesn't fully resolve about what it means that the Fionna world was unauthorized. If the cosmic authority that Scarab represents is capable of sanctioning or revoking the existence of entire universes, what other universes has it looked at and decided to permit? The farm world, which Finn's wish accidentally created, was apparently allowed to continue existing despite being a directly unintended consequence of a wish. The Fionna world is treated as a threat to be contained. The distinction between these cases is never explained. Some unauthorized realities get to persist, and some don't, and the criteria for the judgment are opaque, which is either a deliberate mystery the show intends to develop, or a question the show is happy to leave open.
Given the spin-off received a second season, perhaps we'll find out. There's also something interesting about what the Fionna and Cake arc implies about Ice King's mind as it actually was, rather than as the show usually presented it. The early seasons portray his writing as a joke. An incompetent, lonely wizard has written deeply uncool fan fiction about gender-swapped versions of the people he knows. The later seasons, and especially the spin-off, complicate this considerably. The fan fiction was more than that. It was a connection to a real place, channeled through centuries of madness and expressed in the one creative outlet he had. Ice King in the early seasons is funny and pathetic, and occasionally frightening, but he's also, in every episode he appears in, a being who is trying to create something. He writes, he composes music.
He kidnaps princesses, which is genuinely bad, but the kidnapping is its own form of creative world building. He wants a story to live inside, a narrative in which he gets what he never had. He's building Oo's most elaborate, most consistently harmful piece of fan fiction in real time, using actual people as characters. The Crown took his identity. What it left behind was someone whose defining quality was the need to make things, to imagine alternatives, to reach for a world more bearable than the one he was living in. The Fionna and Cake universe being real is the show's way of saying that this reaching was, in some cosmic sense, heard. Not justified, not redeemable, but heard. The Enchiridion arrives in Season 1 as a guidebook for heroes, a volume of accumulated wisdom about how to be good, how to behave with honor, how to conduct oneself on a quest. It is wholly, in the particular Adventure Time sense of that word, a thing of genuine moral weight. Princess Bubblegum sends Finn to retrieve it as a test of his worthiness. The test involves a series of challenges, and Finn passes them, and he earns the book. He carries it as a symbol of what he aspires to be. For several seasons, the Enchiridion is exactly this: a book, a guidebook. Finn consults it occasionally. It sits in the background of scenes as evidence that he takes the heroism business seriously. It's a lovely idea for an object.
Then, Season 4's finale, The Lich, reveals that the Enchiridion has a secondary function that no one has mentioned before, and that nothing in the previous 3 seasons has suggested. If you take the gems from the crowns of 7 different princesses and embed them in the Enchiridion's cover, it becomes a portal key capable of opening a gateway to the multiverse. The Lich, having spent a couple of seasons orchestrating everything from inside a snail, has been working toward exactly this, using Finn and Jake as tools to gather the necessary gems. Finn eventually smashes the book with Billy's gauntlet, accidentally activating the portal and sending them all into the farm world. The Enchiridion has been a dimensional weapon this whole time, or at least a dimensional device. It has been sitting in Finn's backpack as a potential door to everywhere, waiting for someone to attach the correct gems and use it. There's no foreshadowing of this. The book's function in Seasons 1 through 3 is entirely consistent with Wise Book for Heroes, and not at all consistent with Portal Key requiring 7 princess gems. Princess Bubblegum, who seems to know more about the Enchiridion than she lets on, sent Finn to retrieve it, while apparently understanding it was connected to something dangerous. Why she sent him on this mission, knowing what the book was, the show doesn't explain. She may not have known about the portal function, or she did know and had reasons for wanting Finn to have it that the show never explores. The gem system is its own slightly tangled thing. The gems are from Princess Crowns, and they protect against the Lich's telepathy, as established in Mortal Folly, when Bubblegum gives Finn and Jake protective headgear. They're connected to magical protection. They're also, apparently, connected to dimensional travel when combined with the right book. The show never explains why Princess Crowns have this dual function, why the combination of 7 of them and an old guidebook creates a multiverse portal, or what the cosmological logic behind any of it is. After the Farm World arc, the Enchiridion doesn't really come up again. It was destroyed when Finn smashed it. The portal it opened was both the beginning and the end of its second career as a dimensional device. The show moves on without reflecting on the fact that this sacred object, which Finn earned through genuine heroism, turned out to have been something that the Lich needed for his world-ending plan all along. There's a melancholy version of that which the show doesn't quite sit with. Finn earned the book. He earned it by being good, by making the right choices under difficult circumstances. And the book was, in a sense, a trap. Not for him specifically, but in the sense that its holy significance masked a function that an ancient cosmic death entity was going to use to try to destroy everything. His heroism led him, step by step, to handing the Lich exactly what it needed. Adventure Time acknowledges this only obliquely. The show isn't quite interested in that reading, but it's there if you look. Something else about the Enchiridion arc that gets glossed over in most discussions is the question of Princess Bubblegum's knowledge. She is, by Season 4, clearly aware that the Enchiridion is more than just a book for heroes. She describes it to Finn as dangerous, as something that needs to be kept from the Lich. This suggests she knows about its secondary function, the portal key aspect, or at least knows that it has some dangerous capacity she doesn't want exploited, but she sent Finn to retrieve it in Season 1. The whole first episode is her tasking him with getting the book back from a mountain. Why would she send a 12-year-old boy to recover an artifact she knew was connected to dangerous cosmic power? The most charitable reading is that she sent him because she trusted that the book's own protective mechanisms, the ones that tested his heroism, would keep it out of the wrong hands. The book requires heroism to obtain. Finn is a hero. She trusted that the book would be safest with him. The less charitable reading is that she knew more than she told him and sent him into a situation she hadn't fully explained which is something she does quite a lot across the series in ways that occasionally cause significant problems for everyone involved. Bubblegum has a habit of managing information carefully, revealing things on her own schedule, deciding what Finn and Jake need to know and when. This is sometimes responsible governance and sometimes not. The Enchiridion is a case where her information management left Finn in the position of unknowingly facilitating the Lich's plan across several seasons. After the Enchiridion is destroyed in the Farm World arc, the show eventually addresses Finn's lack of a powerful weapon with a different solution, a series of swords, culminating in the Grass Sword and eventually the Finn Sword, which comes from an alternate timeline version of Finn and has its own complicated existence. The Finn Sword arc is one of the show's more psychologically interesting threads, involving a Finn who is trapped in the sword and whose consciousness eventually merges with a grass spirit to become Fern, a grass duplicate of Finn with Finn's memories and genuine personhood of his own. This is not an Enchiridion plot hole, but it's worth mentioning as context for how the show handles important objects. It introduces them, uses them for a specific story purpose, and then either discards them or transforms them into something new. The Enchiridion was a guidebook, then a portal key, then rubble. The sword was a weapon, then a trapped soul, then a separate person. Adventure Time treats its important objects the way it treats its characters, as things that change rather than things that stay fixed, which is admirable and also creates the occasional loose end. The broader implication of the Enchiridion's journey, if you sit with it, is a slightly melancholy one. Finn spent several seasons growing into the kind of person who deserved to carry the book. The challenges in the first episode that tested his heroism were real tests, requiring real choices. He chose to spare monsters from unnecessary pain. He chose to protect rather than destroy. He carried the book as evidence that those choices mattered, that heroism was a real quality with real weight in the world of Ooo. And then the book turned out to be a dimensional portal key that a cosmic death entity needed to fulfill his plan to end all life. The heroism was real. The tests were real. The object those tests were protecting was something the show had a completely different purpose for. Whether you read this as a commentary on the gap between symbolic meaning and material function, or just as a case of the writers retrofitting a portal device into an existing sacred object. Depends on how generously you're reading the show. I tend toward the generous reading, but the melancholy of it is real either way. BMO is one of the most consistently beloved characters in Adventure Time, a small living game console who lives with Finn and Jake and occupies a very specific emotional register. Innocent, imaginative, genuinely caring, and somehow both deeply confused about the world and deeply wise about certain parts of it. Early BMO is defined more by texture than by biography. We know BMO is alive, is a friend, has inner monologues and private fantasies and a sense of self. We don't know much about where BMO came from. The show adds to this picture gradually, and the additions are mostly wonderful, but they layer in ways that raise more questions than they answer. Web Weirdos and a few other early episodes show us BMO's private life when left alone, playing both sides of a conversation, performing being a human, inventing dramatic scenarios with a tennis ball named football. These sequences have a gentle melancholy to them, BMO filling the quiet of an empty house with characters and narratives, because that's what BMO does. It's presented as both charming and slightly lonely. Football in Season 7 takes this private world much further. BMO's reflection, Football, is revealed to be a real consciousness living in the mirror. She's resentful of her existence as a reflection, wanting more than to be a backwards echo of BMO. She eventually manages to escape into the real world by switching with BMO, who ends up trapped in the mirror instead. The episode treats this as a genuine metaphysical event. Two consciousnesses, real and real, in a situation that requires actual resolution. It's not a dream, it happened. This raises questions about the nature of BMO's inner world that the show doesn't pursue much further. If BMO's reflection is capable of having its own consciousness and desires, and eventually swapping bodies with BMO, what does that say about the imaginative scenarios BMO constructs when alone? Are the characters in those scenarios alive in the same way Football was? The show is happy to leave this as an open, interesting question rather than an answered one. Then, Distant Lands. BMO arrives in 2020 and provides the most concrete piece of BMO's biography. It's set in what appears to be the distant future of the Adventure Time timeline, with BMO as the ruler of a small community in outer space, and it's framed partly as a story BMO tells a young child. Within the story, we learn that BMO was created by a robotics engineer named Mo on a space farm, a floating agricultural installation somewhere in orbit. Mo was unable to have children. He built BMO as his child and eventually sent BMO out into the world with an instruction: find a child to love. This is deeply sweet. It also creates a set of questions about the geography and timeline of the Adventure Time universe that the show doesn't address. The space farm is in space, it's above Ooo, apparently, or at least accessible from Oo's universe. Mo built BMO at some point in the past. When? How long before the main series? Is the space farm still out there during the events of Adventure Time? Is Mo still alive during the main series, and if so, why does he never come up? BMO occasionally behaves as though Mo is a distant memory, a creator long gone. But the episode doesn't specify when Mo died or whether he's even dead. The episode is set in the future, and the timeline it operates in is deliberately loose, so some of this vagueness is intentional. Distant Lands? BMO is more interested in the emotional arc of BMO learning to be a parent figure to a young alien child than in providing precise coordinates for the space farm. That's a reasonable priority, but it does mean that the most detailed piece of BMO's biography raises more questions about the logistics of BMO's existence than it answers. Mo himself is presented as a gentle, eccentric man who clearly loved what he made. His instruction to BMO, find a child to love, was fulfilled when BMO found Finn and Jake. And that's a complete story emotionally. BMO was made to love someone, BMO found Finn, and the decades of adventures they shared together are the fulfillment of Mo's purpose for his creation. Distant Lands, Together Again, the final Distant Lands episode, shows BMO in a world where both Finn and Jake have died. BMO has outlived them. BMO outlives everyone eventually, because BMO is a machine, and machines don't age the way living things do. The episode doesn't dwell on this too long, but it's there. The being who was built to love a child will outlast every child it loves. Every version of the find someone to love instruction ends in this same way, eventually. That's not a plot hole. That's just a quietly devastating thing that the show is willing to let exist without resolving.
BMO's charging and sleep cycle is minor enough that I almost didn't include it, but since we're here, the show is inconsistent about whether BMO ever truly powers down or whether BMO is always to some degree aware. In some episodes, BMO clearly sleeps, has something like dreams, requires rest. In others, BMO appears to be continuously operational, responding to events at all hours. This is the kind of small inconsistency that comes from different writers working on different episodes without a single canonical answer to do game consoles dream of electric sleep. It doesn't break anything, it's just one of those details that doesn't quite resolve if you press on it.
BMO Lost from Season 5 is one of the show's quiet highlights, and is also, if you're thinking about BMO's inner life, one of its more philosophically suggestive episodes. BMO gets separated from Finn and Jake and has to find their way home, encountering a baby bird along the way, and essentially becoming the bird's parent for the duration of the episode. BMO names the bird Jake because BMO misses Jake, teaches the bird, cares for it, and then releases it when it's ready to live on its own. The episode is gentle and sweet, and almost entirely disconnected from the main plot of the season. It exists to show BMO being capable of parental love, which is its own interesting preparation for what Distant Lands BMO will later establish about Mo's intention. Mo built BMO to find a child to love. In BMO Lost, BMO finds a bird to love for a few days and then lets it go. In the main series, BMO loves Finn and Jake and is loved by them in return. In Distant Lands BMO extends this capacity to a young alien child on a space station. BMO's defining characteristic across all of these contexts is this capacity for attentive, gentle, completely committed love. It's what Mo built in. It's the most consistent thing about BMO across every version of the character. The Distant Lands BMO episode also has a detail that doesn't quite square with the established timeline, though it's subtle enough that you have to be paying close attention. The space station BMO ends up on is populated by various alien creatures, and BMO eventually becomes their king. which BMO accepts with characteristic calm. But the station itself and the technology in it implies a level of space travel and habitation that isn't really suggested by Oo's world building in the main series. Ooo has magic. It has advanced candy science. It does not, for most of the main series, appear to have routine space colonization. The BMO Distant Lands episode is set in the future of the story, post Finn and Jake, so perhaps things have advanced significantly. But the gap between Oo's technology level in Season 10 and we have a functioning space colony with alien residents is not bridged by anything in the main show. This is a minor point, and the episode is too lovely to be bothered about it much. BMO as a Space King is a completely natural development for a character who has always operated on their own internal logic, largely independent of what the rest of the world is doing around them. There's also something worth saying about BMO's relationship to the concept of play, which the show uses as a kind of shorthand for BMO's philosophical position. BMO plays constantly, not games in the competitive sense, but in the sense of imaginative engagement, of treating every situation as something to be explored and inhabited, rather than solved and moved past. This is presented as a virtue in Adventure Time's world, not a childishness.
BMO's playfulness is the thing that makes them good company, makes them a wise presence in unexpected moments, makes them the character Finn and Jake can always come home to. It is also, if you're thinking about Mo's design intention, exactly what you would build into a being meant to be a child's companion. Play is the language BMO speaks. Mo made them fluent. Adventure Time's magic works however the story needs it to. This is, if I'm being honest, fine for most of the show's run. A world this strange and inventive, running on consistent, documented magic rules, would be slightly less interesting than a world where magic is organic and surprising and occasionally unexplained. The show earns a lot of its best moments from magic that doesn't require a manual, but there are a few specific moments where the looseness of the rules creates obvious gaps, and a couple where it creates retroactive problems that careful later storytelling accidentally reveals. The clearest example is the Wizard Powers episode. In Season 1's Wizard, Finn and Jake attend a secret wizard school run by a wizard named Bufo, who is scamming people out of their powers to build his own collection. They complete the training, receive wizard powers, and become wizards. They can do wizard things. This is presented as a genuine change in their abilities, and then they never use those powers again. The show's creator, Pendleton Ward, eventually explained on his blog that the wizard powers were contained in the robes Finn and Jake received as part of their graduation, and that the robes were subsequently destroyed. This is the official answer.
It's just that this answer is nowhere in the episode, nowhere in any subsequent episode, and requires the audience to read supplementary materials to discover. Within the show itself, Finn and Jake just become wizards and then stop being wizards without comment. Similarly, the Chamber of Frozen Blades, in Season 2, has Finn and Jake learning ice ninja techniques from books in the Ice King's library. They demonstrate these techniques within the episode. They then never use them again. Producer Adamuto explained that they didn't have enough time to commit the incantations to memory. Again, entirely reasonable, entirely absent from the episode itself. These are small things, but they're the kind of small thing that accumulates into an impression of a show where abilities appear and disappear based on the narrative needs of individual episodes, rather than a coherent picture of what Finn and Jake are capable of.
The broader magic system in Ooo evolves considerably over the show's run, and the later version doesn't entirely absorb the earlier one. Early seasons present magic as ambient and varied. There are wizards with idiosyncratic abilities. There are magical artifacts with specific functions. There are creatures of various kinds with innate powers. The world is full of magic in a loose fairy tale way, and the rules are flexible because the show hasn't committed to any particular structure. Later seasons introduce the concept of the 4 elementals, fundamental forces underlying Oo's magic: fire, slime, candy, and ice. Each elemental is a being who embodies and channels one of these forces. Princess Bubblegum is the candy elemental. Flame Princess is the fire elemental. Ice King is, in some sense, a distorted echo of the ice elemental, the crown being a corrupted version of that power.
The elementals are described as having existed across many lifetimes, reincarnating each cycle, maintaining the magical balance of the world. This is a genuine system. It has internal structure. It explains several things that were previously explained only as magic. But the early seasons magic doesn't connect to this system. Magic Man, a Martian wizard who appears across the show as a chaotic presence, transforming people arbitrarily, seems to operate completely outside the elemental framework. His power is enormous. He can reshape reality on a local level, transform living beings into inanimate objects, alter the laws of physics within his vicinity. None of this is elemental magic. It's something else, something the show calls wizard magic and never quantifies. Where does it come from? How does it relate to the elemental system? The show doesn't say because it isn't interested in a unified theory of magic. It's interested in Magic Man's grief, in the reason behind his cruelty, in the portrait of a being who weaponized his loneliness and his power simultaneously. The mechanics can take care of themselves. There's one specific magical inconsistency that I find particularly interesting because it appears in such closely adjacent episodes. In Mortal Folly, Princess Bubblegum gives Finn and Jake gems from Princess Crowns that protect against the Lich's telepathic influence. The gems work. The gems are from crowns. Princess Crowns apparently have mind protection properties, which is a piece of Ooo magic that makes a kind of sense in a world where princesses are powerful and meaningful figures. But Bubblegum also wears earrings throughout the show that are described at some point as protective against the Lich. Are these earrings the same mechanism as the gem protection? Are they a different system that happens to have the same effect? The show never specifies. Two separate magical protections against the same threat, potentially operating via the same or different principles, existing side by side without being connected or contrasted. This is the kind of thing that only matters if you're already paying very close attention. And given that we're this far into a late-night essay about Adventure Time's inconsistencies, I think it's safe to assume we are. The show's attitude toward its own magic rules is probably best summed up by a moment from Wizard Battle in Season 3, where a competition of wizards is held with a bizarre prize, and the female wizards in the crowd react with open irritation when the prize is announced. The episode has the wizards acknowledge the absurdity of their situation while continuing to participate in it. Adventure Time's magic is like that, aware of its own strangeness, not particularly interested in justifying it, more curious about what the strangeness reveals about the characters inhabiting it, which is, honestly, the show's deepest instinct operating correctly. Magic that obeys rigid rules is technology. Magic that works on its own logic, shaped by desire and grief and loneliness and love, is what Adventure Time was always actually about. Death himself as a character who appears in Death in Bloom and a few other episodes is worth a small digression here. He's a tall, skeletal figure who rules the land of the dead, keeps his wife as a trophy, and has specific rules about who can leave his domain and under what circumstances. Finn and Jake navigate his rules in Death in Bloom to retrieve Princess Bubblegum's soul after it accidentally gets dragged along with some flowers. They win a music contest to earn her back. The mechanics of Death's domain imply a fairly specific and consistent afterlife system. People who die end up somewhere, are managed by Death, can under certain circumstances be returned to life. Later seasons expand on this considerably, with the Citadel as a prison for cosmic criminals, with Prismo existing in a space outside time, with various cosmic entities having specific jurisdictions and limitations. The show's afterlife and cosmic architecture does build towards something coherent.
But Death's rules, as presented in Death in Bloom, don't quite match the rules as they're presented later. In that episode, a music contest can win a soul back. In later episodes, returning from death requires significant cosmic machinery or specific wish granting. Are these different levels of death, different categories of the afterlife? Does the land of the dead that Death rules have different laws from whatever system governs the fates of, say, Billy or Prismo? The show doesn't connect these dots. Prismo's situation is its own small puzzle. He's a two-dimensional being who exists in the time room, outside of time, capable of granting any wish. He's also a projection of an old man who is sleeping in the real world. If the old man wakes up, Prismo stops existing. This is established clearly in Jake the Dog. Much later, when the Lich kills Prismo, Finn and Jake have to figure out how to bring him back, which they do by causing the old man to fall back asleep through a series of maneuvers. Prismo is restored. But the mechanism of Prismo's existence implies that killing him wouldn't really end him, just interrupt him. He could always be restored as long as the old man sleeps. So what exactly did the Lich accomplish? The show treats Prismo's death as consequential and significant, but the restoration is also accomplished, which means the significance was more about the violation of something precious than about any permanent change to the cosmic order. The show has its reasons for the story it tells. The cosmological logic underneath it is somewhat loose. None of this diminishes the show.
Adventure Time's magic rules being elastic is a feature, not a bug, of a program that consistently chose emotional resonance over systematic consistency. That's a reasonable priority. The inconsistencies are the cost of it, and the cost was worth paying. There's something that I keep coming back to, sitting with all of this. Adventure Time built its world the way a person builds anything over a decade, adding more, changing direction, occasionally knocking something over and deciding it was meant to be there. The inconsistencies in the Ice King's age, the bite marks on young Marceline that shouldn't exist, the Enchiridion's second life as a dimensional key, Jake's alien parasite biology, Finn's entire population of humans who were never quite the last of anything. These aren't failures, they're evidence. Evidence of a show that grew into something none of the people making it had fully anticipated at the start, that kept asking larger questions than it had originally signed up for, and that occasionally had to quietly rewrite its earlier answers to accommodate how much bigger the story had become. Simon Petrikov is probably the clearest example of what I mean. He was introduced as a bit, a funny villain, with a sad secret, and then that sad secret turned out to be the spine of the whole show. A person who lost himself slowly, who held on as long as he could, who left a letter to a child apologizing for what he was going to become. The math on his age doesn't quite work. The 600 versus the 1,000, the biological 47 stretching across a millennium, the retroactive explanation for why the crown doesn't destroy everyone who touches it. None of that arithmetic resolves cleanly. But Simon Petrikov singing the Cheers theme to a child in the ruins of the world because it's the only thing that helps her sleep is one of the most genuinely affecting things I've seen in any animated program, and the age of the man doing it doesn't change that at all. So that's what we've been doing tonight, not picking apart something to diminish it, but sitting with the seams in something we love, and finding that they're interesting, that they tell a story about how the show grew, about what it was trying to do, and how its ambitions outpaced its earlier planning in all the best ways. The inconsistencies are a map of the distance Adventure Time travelled from where it started to where it ended up. That's a good kind of map to have. I've got more of these planned. The Distant Land specials have their own set of threads to trace, and the Fionna and Cake spin-off, now that its second season is out, raises questions I haven't properly gotten into yet. That's for another evening. For now, I hope this was a good thing to fall asleep to.